Right off the shores of Lake Michigan, adjacent to some decrepit train tracks and the Illinois state border, is a long-forgotten, disheveled monument from another time. Astonishingly, this is the oldest monument in all of Chicago, and the third oldest structure in the entire city. And although it has since been moved about 191 feet from its original location, it remains mostly untouched. But what does this monument represent? Who put this here, and why has it been almost entirely forgotten? Join me to find out, as today we discover the history of Chicago's state boundary marker. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Crossing state lines 186 years ago when this monument was put here was an entirely different experience from what we know today. The borders were often vaguely indicated and there was no unified system to include welcome signage. The most basic markings included natural geographical features like rivers, mountains, or prominent trees. In some cases, trees would be planted explicitly to mark the territory. In fact, this was nothing new. Native Americans also used this technique for centuries to mark trails along territories, in a process described by academics as cultural modification. The trees would be transformed into bizarre geometric shapes not possible in nature. Anyhow, when the United States emerged on the map, the states themselves enjoyed a high level of autonomy, meaning they were almost more like independent countries in a way. There were instances of states attempting to impose import-export tariffs on one another, and they would also routinely get into squabbles over territory. These tensions were also enhanced by the fact that citizens embraced the identity of their home state over the federal nation. And it's no wonder, considering how decentralized America still was. In other words, in 1838, when the state boundary marker was placed, American states were still struggling to find a balance between wider integration and the assertion of state sovereignty. This type of struggle is nothing new, and North America is littered with old boundary markers from the dawn of European settlement, including notable examples such as those left by Mason and Dixon, or the Point of the Beginning marker, which commemorates the 1785 survey that initiated the mapping of America. The marker we can see today was constructed in 1838 to mark the resurvey of the state line in 1833, as previously both states were a part of the Greater Northwest Territory. We also have the oldest federally placed stones, outlining the territory of Washington, D.C. Placed in 1790, these 40 stones created a diamond of 10 miles on each side, and they still exist today. Found in what became people's front yards, and one even appears to have been encased in a sewer drain. Finally, there is the oldest marker placed by Europeans called Bound Rock, which was set by Captain Nicholas Sharpley in 1657 to determine the line between Hampton and Salisbury. The rock was lost for decades due to the shifting river, but was ultimately rediscovered and preserved as a landmark in 1937. With that in mind, when it comes to the Illinois-Indiana marker placed on the bank of Lake Michigan, the Midwest was also trying to find its identity and a balance. Anyone who has been to this part of Chicago now most likely recalls it as a highly trafficked industrial area, if not a type of no man's land. However, when this monument was built, the landscape was completely different. There was no interstate system, just some fields and rail lines to the east coast. The monument was erected here by the Illinois General Assembly in 1833 to commemorate the establishment of the common boundary between two states. It's a simple limestone structure standing at 15.5 feet tall and weighing in at over 38,000 pounds. According to Chicago's Department of Planning and Development, it serves as a significant reminder of early 19th century efforts to assert clear boundaries. Yet at the same time, this monument was a symbol of unity, as the landmark in its original location straddled both sides of the state line evenly. The obelisk is believed to have originally been engraved with an inscription when erected in 1838, but those engravings have completely worn away. Not unlike most state line boundaries, the monument was never a popular tourist destination, nor did most even know of its existence. That was, however, until the turn of the century, when Samuel Insull commissioned what was to be the largest power plant on Earth. I'm referring to the State Line Generating Plant. This plant made sense in terms of serving the demands of a growing South Side, but it was also established in this particular location to serve Insull's holding companies, which controlled the Chicago South Shore and South Bend, an electric railroad that ran near the site of the State Line power plant. So as this beautiful Art Deco power plant was set up in 1929, the already aging state boundary monument was moved out of its way. Now, this part of the story is particularly unclear, as I was unable to establish the monument's precise original location. Some accounts claimed that the original location was frequently flooded by the lake, leading me to suspect that it stood on a foundation still visible in the lake today. However, when I examined old photos of the power plant, this platform is not visible at all, and there is another similar one further out in the lake, leading me to believe that it was probably an industrial utility of the plant rather than a monument platform. Either way, by 1980, the monument was in very bad shape. It had been vandalized and damaged from the elements, hence Alan J. Benson, a ComEd executive at the nearby plant, persuaded his company to sponsor the restoration in partnership with groups like the East Side Historical Society. And in 1988, the marker was relocated near the plant's gate, 191 feet north of its original site, but still on the state line. And although Benson didn't live to see the marker's new location or new base, the plaque next to the marker bears his name. But what became of the location where the monument stood? Well, it's also unclear, but I'll try to explain. So here we have a satellite view of the monument from 2010 in its current position. And according to most sources, the monument was actually moved north 191 feet. So if you look here, I would make the argument that this is the original site of the state monument right on these train tracks here. And it's a good thing that we found this and that we have record of these older photos, as if you turn the time forward, all right, to 2000 and let's say 11, you can see that the train yard is changing a bit. And by 2012, there are no more freight train carriages on the track. If you go forward yet another year, the tracks disappear. So this is a really good illustration of just how easy history gets lost. Throughout these years, the original site of this monument, if I'm correct in my hypothesis here, remains visible until we get closer to the current day, when it starts to get covered in shrubs. And so I'm not sure what became of this ultimately. If there's anyone from Chicago who knows, I would be very, very curious to find out. The 1990s weren't a great time for the monument either, as the coal plant fell into disfavor and the company began to modernize elsewhere, leading to its complete closure in 2012. And since the plant's private security also looked after the monument, it was left unprotected completely when the majority of the complex was demolished in 2014. Once again vulnerable to vandals, in 2015, the plaques reading Boundary of Illinois and Boundary of Indiana, along with the location of the marker, was stolen, and there are no plans to replace them. The state line boundary marker is truly one of a kind. This is the oldest monument in Chicago, and if we want to get technical, it is the third oldest structure in all of Chicago, just behind the Noble Seymour Crippen House in Norwood Park and the Henry B. Clark House in the South Loop. There are very few monuments like this in America, and although it was designated a local landmark in 2003, its story is fading fast. When Alan J. Benson passed away in 1987, I'd argue that a lot was lost along with him, as it's doubtful that Chicago will ever find another advocate for this monument with the influence required to ensure its preservation. This is nothing unusual, as if we look to the great border markers of history, sooner or later, they almost always meet their demise. Take the Three Emperors Corner in Europe as an example. This location was where the great empires of Russia, Austria-Hungary, and the German Empire once met. But that's not all. This fascinating tri-border in Europe once had a massive 72-foot-tall Bismarck Tower, which was frequented by between 3,000 and 8,000 tourists per week back in 1907. Yet, if we travel to that same location today, not only does nothing remain, but very few people even realize that this was once the tri-border of 3 European superpowers. It's just empty, and perhaps a bit creepy. My point is, if the border markers of major empires fall, it would sure take a lot of luck to save the one on the Indiana border. Even so, in the case of the Boundary Monument, I'm hoping that history will prove me wrong. We'll just have to wait and see. And until then, I'm Ryan Sokash, signing off.